Yelan had departed the same day after her meeting with Kokomi, the Alcor having been settled along Narukami Island's docks. Beidou had decided to keep herself within range of Inazuma, having checked in every day to be sure that her comrades were safe. Her ship had been docked when Yelan had come to Inazuma's harbor for a request for transport back to Mondstadt, having discussed the events of her days in Inazuma upon crossing paths with Beidou. It wasn't long after that Yelan had boarded the ship and started her one-day trip back to Mondstadt to carry out her end of the deal. She was used to traveling and doing operations as such solo, but there was always a slight tingle of fear in her that surfaced in it, especially considering that she couldn't determine if her enemy was in sight or not. However, she had shrugged off that fear, knowing she couldn't fail, and to succeed, her state of mind and focus had to be cleared of all emotions. Ganyu and Keqing had returned to Narukami Island and had immediately returned to Tenshukaku to relay all of their plans and information to A as soon as she had returned from the central point of Inazuma's entirety. The trip had taken nearly the entire day, so following their return to the Electro Archon's abode, they had returned to the Kamisato estate to rest. Upon their arrival, they had been greeted by Toma and the aroma of a freshly cooked dinner. It was a relief to the two, seeing they had been through a lot in that one day. Therefore, a hot meal was just what they needed in the end. Ayaka hadn't joined them, too busy with governmental affairs elsewhere, but Keqing and Ganyu knew they were in for a long next day, so they had eaten their food, taken separate baths to wash away their stress from that day, and retired to slumber in each other's arms. Their embrace had prevented either of their dreams from being disturbed by any sort of negative thoughts or entities, having dreamt only of a beautiful and peaceful fantasy that they hoped to be reality someday. The two of them were sitting along one of the many peaks of Mount Aochang together, a beautiful sunset accompanying them in the background. They were holding hands and talking about their future together, making a promise that they'd always be together, even beyond death. The conversation was like a distant whisper that was inaudible for either of them to distinguish, as if some force were preventing them from listening in. However, Ganyu's advanced sense of hearing caught one specific pair of words that left her puzzled. Someday, we'll find them, and that's a promise. It had come from Keqing, which made Ganyu wonder what she was promising to her. However, she didn't dwell on it too much, because upon her waking to the scent of breakfast, she had forgotten almost everything. Everything except for the sight of them together. Now she lays under the sheets with a puzzled mind, but lets her fantasies go and decides to get up for the day. It was only a dream, Ganyu, she said to herself, half asleep. No need to investigate fantasies. Only focus on what's actually real. With that said, she stripped herself of her nightgown and situated herself into her day clothes. After her body was adorned with proper daily attire, she moved out to the kitchen where she was greeted by Toma. However, Keqing was absent, immediately piquing her curiosity. Good morning, Miss Ganyu, Toma greeted with a smile. Good morning, Mr. Toma, she greeted back, immediately addressing her curiosity. May I ask if you know where Keqing is? Toma nodded, following with a clear answer. Yes, she's out front. She said she wanted to do some training. Ah, I see, Ganyu answered. Thank you. Toma nodded again. Please, have some breakfast, Miss Ganyu. You'll need it for the day ahead. That's all right, but I'll take some tea if you have some brewed. Of course. There's a fresh pot on the counter, he said, pointing to the resting teapot just out of Ganyu's sight. Please, help yourself. Ganyu answered with a nod and smile, working her way to the teapot and pouring herself a serving. It was clearly a fresh brew, given the thick and hot mist steaming from her cup. Just from the smell and color of the beverage, Ganyu immediately recognized the type of tea it was. It was an herbal tea that was consumed mainly during the morning hours to help awaken the mind of whoever consumed it. It had helped her in her occupation hundreds of times to stay sharp and focused. Just what she needed for the day ahead of her. She took a careful sip to test the temperature, and was shocked to find that, despite the massive amounts of steam raging from her teacup, it was a perfect temperature for anybody who regularly drank tea. However, upon swallowing the amount she'd drunk with caution, she was met with a sweet aftertaste that she'd never experienced before. She could only guess that it was due to the tea having some other ingredient that was meant to give it extra flavor, something she didn't dislike in the slightest.
Excuse me, Mr. Toma.
She addressed, catching the recipient's attention instantly.
Oh? What is it, Miss Ganyu?
What kind of tea is this exactly?
It's nothing bad. I'm just curious.
Toma nodded in assurance, as if he wasn't surprised at the question. You aren't the first to ask that question. That is the Kamisato blend, a tea blend that has been passed down for centuries by the Kamisato family. The blend is a secret recipe that only Mr. and Miss Kamisato know of. They make it in secret and distribute it throughout Inazuma. Even I don't know how it's made. Just know it's said to sharpen the senses of whoever drinks it. A perfect benefit for anybody who wields a weapon of some sort. Ganyu smiled, fascinated by the story behind her current beverage.
I see. Thank you.
Toma only nodded as Ganyu gripped her teacup and started for the front part of the estate. Upon finding her way outside, Ganyu was met with the sight of her beloved swinging her blade and performing attack patterns that she was familiar with. Ganyu didn't say anything and just watched as a spectator, taking slow and subtle sips of her tea every so often. She had been sitting for over 5 minutes before Keqing had noticed her beloved's presence, to which she stopped to catch her breath.
Oh, please don't stop just because I'm here, Keqing.
Ganyu insisted, to which Keqing just smiled and shook her head.
It's all right. I've been at this for a while, so I think it's about time I took a break.
Ganyu smiled in return, allowing her love to take a seat next to her on the steps. After seating herself next to Ganyu, Keqing worked to catch her breath, wiping away the beads of sweat slithering down her forehead.
Good morning,
Keqing said sweetly between breaths.
I hope I didn't wake you when I got up.
Ganyu shook her head.
Nope. I actually had a really peaceful dream and slept wonderfully.
Keqing smiled at that, meeting Ganyu's gaze.
Good. That makes me happy.
She replied in a happy tone.
What did you dream of? A fantasy that I wished was reality.
Ganyu said softly.
A peaceful life with you, atop Mount Akshong, and a beautiful sunset as the background.
Keqing blushed at the answer, answering with something that Ganyu wasn't expecting.
Really? That's odd, because I had the same dream.
She answered.
We're sitting on the edge of Mount Akshong and talking, but I couldn't tell what was being said. Huh, that is definitely bizarre. But I've heard that lovers can have the same dream because they share the same bond.
Ganyu explained.
It would make sense, given how things are right now. But I really do wonder if that dream can become a reality someday.
A warm touch embraced Ganyu's right hand, her gaze meeting Keqing's own left, gently resting atop it upon investigating. Her sight was shifted back to her love's, staring at her with an assuring expression.
It can, and when this is all over, it will be our reality,
she said comfortingly.
But what if we don't survive the battle?
Ganyu added.
If we don't stop the Tsaritsa in time, We will be in a fight unlike anything we've ever faced, and victory will not be an easy feat. Therefore, we may die on the battlefield before we even get that chance.
Keqing didn't flinch, only held the same expression upon her reply.
If we end up fighting the Tsaritsa and die in the battle, then that dream will be our reality after death. Nothing will tear us apart, not even the Tsaritsa.
Ganyu smiled, leaning over to Keqing and giving her a soft kiss.
I love you,
Ganyu said softly.
I love you too,
Keqing replied. Upon those final words, the moment was interrupted by the voice of someone familiar.
Well, I hope I'm not interrupting anything.
The voice of Ayaka spoke, causing Ganyu and Keqing to turn to the direction of where the voice had come from. Standing just outside of the training area was Kamisato Ayaka with a massive blush on her face, to which the two lovers addressed the situation with haste.
Oh, don't worry, you're not,
Keqing answered.
We were just talking about some things.
Ayaka folded her arms and giggled lightly, clearly aware that kissing didn't imply talking about some things. Regardless, she returned to her actual task at hand and started to explain.
All right. Anyway, I need you two to get ready. The Shogun wants you to come to Tenchukaku for further details on the plan we arranged yesterday.
Keqing and Ganyu nodded in agreement, knowing it was time to get serious.
Understood. Let's meet back here in about a half hour. Then we'll all head to meet with the Raiden Shogun,
Keqing assured.
Sounds good,
Ayaka replied. With that said, Ganyu and Keqing got to their feet and headed back into the estate to prepare for what could be the fate of Inazuma itself. Upon entering Tenchukaku, Ganyu, Keqing, and Ayaka were met with some unexpected guests. Kokomi, Kujosara, and Yaimiko standing with their backs to them before A's stage. Their entry caught all three of the occupants' attention, turning to meet the gazes of Ayaka, Ganyu, and Keqing shortly after stepping past the doorway. Kokomi was the biggest surprise, seeing she was the divine priestess of her own little empire. Leaving Watatsumi Island to come here was a risky move, but at the same time, both Ganyu and Keqing knew it was critical for her to make the trip. She needed to be completely aware of every single aspect of their plans to defend Inazuma and prepare for an all-out life or death battle for the fate of all of Teyvat. There was clear tension in the room, but grudges and past affairs didn't matter right now. If they were going to protect Inazuma, they all had to work together despite the past.
Good, you're all here,
Kujosara greeted in her usual tone.
Now we can get started.
She turned her gaze to A, said Archon, nodding her head as a green light to continue with the proceedings.
Very well,
A stated, standing up from her throne and continuing to speak.
Thank you all for coming, despite our past conflicts. As you are all aware, Inazuma and the entirety of Teyvat is in danger of absolute annihilation by the Tsaritsa. One Archon, Morex, has already been taken to be used as a power source for our main foe that can exist among us without a hint of detection. That means that we may already have enemies among our society, and that means that we must find a way to snuff them out. I've already devised a solution to prevent any others from escaping or entering by putting all of Inazuma under a practical quarantine.
I've already put an electro barrier over all of Inazuma and have locked our enemies in, preventing them from going anywhere. However, I plan to use a similar tactic in hope of easily stopping these machines before they can act. Using a fake ruse, I will gather all of Narukami Island's people into one area and summon a storm within another barrier. Just as I did to prevent any foreigners from entering during the Vision Hunt Decree's duration. The rain will exploit the enemy and stop them dead in their tracks, seeing, even though they possess godly strength and abilities, they're still susceptible to water. But what would gather an entire island's population into one place? Keqing inquired. More importantly, how can you be sure that all of the citizens would show up? That is where you come in. Yai intervened. A and I discussed this throughout the night, and realized the same exact factor you just mentioned. However, we also came up with an answer to it, and it involves you two, seeing you know the most about these things and how to fight them. Exactly. A chimed back in. The plan is for all of us to be separated into two groups. Yai, myself, and Kujo-Sara will remain in the gathering area, while you two and Miss Kamisato remain within the city. Your task will be to check for any people who stayed behind, and to move them out into the rain. And what if nothing happens? Keqing questioned. Allow them to return to their residence peacefully. A answered. A tinge of fear pinged Ganyu and Keqing's hearts at the plan. Facing the very thing that traumatized them that night was the worst task they could have ever been assigned. But after a moment of thought, realized this wouldn't be the last time they'd be assigned this task. It was inevitable. In the end, they'd have to fight the Sarita's creations hundreds to thousands of times. A thought that solidified the final decision on the matter. All right, I'm in agreement. Keqing agreed with confidence. As am I. Ganyu followed, having come to the same conclusion in her mind. I am too, Your Grace. Ayaka confirmed with a bow. Suddenly, upon remembering a very critical aspect of fighting the Sarita's androids, Ganyu quickly added to the mix. One thing that you all should be aware of, shall you need to defend yourselves, is that you cannot fight these things with elemental energy that is manifested through the use of a vision or a god's energy. You must fight them with natural elements or brute strength. Otherwise, they will absorb the energy and use it to enhance their strength and abilities. Gasps emitted from Yai, A, Sara, Ayaka, and Kokomi, now aware that this battle wouldn't be an easy feat, shall push come to shove. Well, that certainly won't be easy, seeing most people capable of combat rely on elemental power to fight. Yai commented. It seems that Sarita really put a lot of thought into her plan by creating machines that can only be stopped by natural elemental power or physical combat. Therefore, I have a suggestion regarding Miss Ganyu's statement. What do you have in mind, Miko? A questioned. All vision bearers should confiscate their respective visions prior to the mission. That way, we have no risk of empowering those pawns. Nobody liked that idea, but it wasn't for forever, and Yai was right. No risk was better than another potential Leeway Harbor disaster, and the risk of casualties was much less likely. To support Yai's suggestion, Ganyu and Keqing added their own thoughts. She's right. It's best to not risk anybody's life, or worse, all of Inazuma. I've witnessed how destructive these things are when enhanced by elemental energy, and I can tell you that it's beyond the ability of any god in this world. It will only be temporary, and it's the best solution to avoid another destruction of a nation. Silence followed, but after a long minute of thought, everyone, excluding A and Yai, nodded in agreement.
I can handle these things without my vision just fine,
Ayaka stated.
I was trained all my life for things such as this, and I will not fail to defend the people of Inazuma and Teyvat.
Her voice was calm and stoic, showing her sincerity in the current situation. There was no doubting that, when it came to the fight, she'd fight until her last breath.
I will guard the Shogun with all of my might,
Sara declared.
Vision or no vision. While being devoid of my vision will be an odd sensation, I haven't survived centuries as a kitsune by luck,
Yae added.
I was around during Inazuma's darkest days, and just as I fought for it then, I shall fight for it again. My vision has never been my main source of strength,
Kokomi added.
As the divine priestess of Watatsumi Island, my strength has always come from my knowledge as a strategist, and my people's will to survive. Despite the past, I will do all I can to rid our land of these monsters.
Everyone was in agreement. Therefore, A moved forward with the next part of her scheme.
Thank you for sacrificing a very dear part of yourselves for the good of Inazuma. Your sincerity will not be forgotten.
Everyone nodded in thanks, to which A moved on with the proceedings.
Now, onto what we will need to prepare for this oncoming storm. First, we must increase the security of Narukami Island to make sure that no one leaves before we can initiate the plan. It is critical that no potential threats escape. Otherwise, that could bring the Tsuritsa right to our shores. To prevent this, I will assign all of the Shogunate soldiers to posts all around Narukami Island to assure we have eyes near every possible escape route. I have already discussed this with Kujo-Sara, and as soon as this meeting is adjourned, she will proceed to lead her fellow soldiers to the assigned areas. However, we will need eyes from afar as well, and that's where Miss Kokomi's army will be posted out on the waters within the island's borders. They have been provided with flares to alert any of the shogunate within sight of suspicious activity, and from there will detain the suspect and be brought here for further questioning. Next, I will lead all of Narukami Island citizens to a place that I will disguise as the location of a festival with free entry. Once they are all gathered, I will enclose the entire island in a dome, preventing anyone from leaving. After that, I will manifest the storm and subdue any imposters with the downpour, while on the other side, Miss Ganyu, Keqing, and Kamisato will search for and exploit any absent citizens. As for Miss Kokomi herself, I've tasked her with devising traps near any other potential exits. These will be used to slow down any potential threats and are all safe from causing any harm to any non-enemy victims that may get caught. They will be disguised as decoration for the fake festival and will not be easy to detect. I've witnessed Miss Kokomi's skills firsthand, so I am confident that she can construct competent obstacles for our enemies that may not take the bait. You have my word,
Kokomi stated.
I will assure nobody gets hurt in this mission.
A responded with a nod.
As for Miko, she will be tasked with protecting all of the citizens on our side, shall anything go awry. Even without a vision, Miko has abilities that can suffice as a proper defense, shall she need to protect anyone. This plan is set to occur within a few days, so please take time to prepare yourselves. I will send a messenger if anything happens before then, but for now, I ask that all of you do your best to stay safe. This meeting is adjourned, unless anyone has any questions.
No one spoke or moved an inch, closing the meeting and starting the build-up to one of the most important operations that Inazuma had ever experienced. There was no room for failure, and everyone present knew it. In 3 days, all hell would break loose, and the fate of Inazuma would be determined. Everyone's nerves were in a chaotic frenzy as they exited Tenshukaku and went their separate ways to prepare for the potential end of the Land of Eternity. The trip back to Mondstadt had been turbulent and anxious for Yelan, currently enjoying a cup of tea in Beto's private quarters. It was nothing more than a long room with a queen-size bed, blanketed with crimson-red sheets made of fine fabric that was far from cheap, and a bedside table that housed only one lone object atop its structure. That one thing was a picture of her crew and best friend Ningguang, huddled together at a banquet, drunk as hell. That had been one of Beto's most treasured memories, having very little recollection of that night from the moment she'd poured herself a third pint of rum. A fine one that had aged for over 2 centuries before the cork had been released from its bottleneck prison. It had been too good of a pristine alcohol to not go back for at least a third serving. However, that had been all it had taken to dilute every fiber of her senses to nothing but a drunken mess. However, she hadn't been the only victim to drunkenness, Ningguang having faltered as well, but with a stronger alcohol tolerance, had managed to remain somewhat sensible for the sake of her role as the Tianquan of Liyue. It was a carefree night of laughs, embarrassment, and memories that wouldn't be forgotten so easily. Just looking at the picture destroyed Beto emotionally, but for Yelan's sake, had kept herself composed to accompany her friend and comrade. "We should be arriving soon," Beto said. "We'll have to dock near Falcon Coast, seeing it's best not to endanger your safety by having to travel through Whispering Woods." "I appreciate that, but you don't need to worry about my safety," Yelan assured. "A few hilichurls are nothing I can't handle. Not even the Snow Witch we share as a common enemy could stop me the night everything went south. So, it'll take more than a hilichurl to kill me." "Believe me, I know. But, well, you are one of the only friends I have left, and I'd rather not lose anyone else right now." Yelan felt a ping in her heart, realizing that she'd not taken Beto's feelings into account. Therefore, she quickly acted to make up for her unintended carelessness. "Oh, I'm sorry, Captain Beto. I didn't realize." Beto waved off the words with a wave of her right hand, assuring Yelan she knew she hadn't meant any ill intent. "It's all right. Don't worry about it. I've just been so afraid of losing someone else to those bastards since the day I found out the horrid truth of our current reality. It was like my heart had been stabbed over 100 times, and I don't want to feel that aching pain again." She paused briefly, sighing heavily before speaking again. "Can I make just one request of you, Miss Yelan?" Yelan's curiosity spiked, averting her gaze from her reflection in her tea to Beto's. What is it?" Yelan answered. Beto sighed again. "No matter what, no matter how bleak things may seem, you will do your best to stay alive. This goes for Keqing and Ganyu as well." Yelan gasped at the request, but she understood exactly why Beto had asked her this. She was hurting, and was scared to death of being alone in their current world. A realization that made Yelan's heart drop in sadness. However, she held her emotions and nodded her head in assurance. "Okay, I promise to hold your request to the moment I inevitably stop breathing. You have my word, as much as Ganyu and Keqing's as well." Beto nodded, her expression holding a look of seriousness and trust. Upon the agreement being solidified, a sudden abruption from above deck broke the still rhythm of the waves leading the Alcor to Falcon Coast. A sudden exclamation that immediately drove Yelan and Beto into action.
"Smoke in the distance! All hands on deck immediately!"
Smoke. That one word was enough to send Beto and Yelan to the top deck without hesitation. It was something they had wished to not even have heard, because smoke meant only one thing: fire. Upon meeting the main deck, Beidou quickly addressed the situation, but upon looking out, she was met with a massive plume of visible smoke. Yelan saw it too, and froze in horror at the realization that it was coming from the direction of Mondstadt. No! Yelan's words were only a whisper as Beidou started her duty as a captain.
Full speed ahead! Everyone to your positions, now!
She commanded. Every crewmate moved immediately, rushing to their positions and acting as fast as possible. It wasn't long before the ship had clearly begun to travel faster, Falcon Coast coming into eyeshot in no time. However, that still wasn't fast enough for Yelan, knowing for a fact that the smoke wasn't the result of a forced fire. Mondstadt was under attack, and at risk of becoming another Liyue harbor. She couldn't wait for the ship to dock. Lives were at risk. Therefore, as soon as the ship was within distance of what her stamina could handle, she immediately took action. "I'm sorry, Captain Beidou, but I can't wait any longer," she stated anxiously. "You get the ship docked. I need to save who I can."
Yelan, wait!
Yelan didn't hear her, and with no further word, ran to the east side of the deck and jumped over the side. Beidou saw it out of the corner of her eye, but didn't give chase. She had a ship to command, and she knew Yelan was no fool or pushover. She gritted her teeth at the truth of the matter, but knew she needed to focus right now. Therefore, she continued to command the ship, while Yelan went on ahead. "You damn best stay alive," Beidou said to herself, following with her moving to steer the ship to Falcon Coast safely. On the other end of the situation, Yelan had already found herself to the shores of the coast, and with no thought or moment of rest, ran off in the direction of Mondstadt. She followed the main trail past the beach, the nearby Statue of the Seven, and onto the main dirt roads that led to the bridge that led to Mondstadt's gateway. In her heart, she prayed that she wasn't too late, but the closer she got, the more her hopes started to sink into the pit of her stomach. It was just like the aftermath of Liyue Harbor, a thick mist of white smoke that came from the smoldering debris that was still burning. It was haunting and sickening, and upon meeting and crossing the bridge, the truth came to light with an agonizing pain that hurt more than any wound she'd ever been dealt. She was too late. The city was littered with ash, scorched homes and establishments, and an ungodly number of charred and blood-stained corpses. The damage was already done, and whoever had caused it was long gone. The sight before Yelan sent her to her knees, crying and cursing to the wind. Women, men, and children, all dead and left to burn in what remained of Mondstadt's ruins. She pounded her fists on the ground and screamed in agony, up until she heard a sound. A cry for help. It was distant, but Yelan didn't care, getting to her feet and calling out for whoever she had heard. "Hello?" She cried out, hoping the voice she had heard wasn't just a figment of her imagination. It was silent for a few seconds, but then something broke through. The voice of a woman coming from within one of the nearby buildings. Yelan moved fast, shuffling through the rubble blocking the door and moving inside to the sight of more toppled debris. She used every bit of her strength to remove the litter from the floor, eventually finding the lady who had called out to her. She was horribly burned and covered in cuts and soot, leading Yelan to assure the victim that help was on the way. "Don't move, ma'am," she directed. "You're in bad shape and need medical assistance." She grunted and hyperventilated from her injuries as Yelan worked quickly to make room to get her out of the building. Until then, Yelan decided to comfort the victim and hopefully get some information. "Can you tell me your name?" Yelan asked, not wanting to be too pushy or forceful. It took a lot of strength, but eventually she did get a response.
Marjorie.
Her voice was nothing more than a raspy whisper, further clarifying that she needed to get her out of there. "All right, Marjorie. I'm Yelan, and I'm here to get you out of here. Therefore, I'm going to need you to do your best to work with me so I can get you out. Are any of your bones broken?"
My leg.
Upon that response and confirmation, Yelan worked to analyze her legs, quickly finding the broken one upon seeing that her left ankle had a compound fracture. Luckily, she had seen a handful of these in her years as an agent of the Ministry of Civil Affairs, so she'd be able to lift and get Marjorie out to safety without hurting her. "All right, Marjorie. This is gonna hurt, but I need you to toughen through the pain. I need to get you out of this place before it collapses." Marjorie didn't like the idea, but knew Yelan was right. Therefore, she slowly nodded her head and braced herself for impact. With as much gentle care as she could, Yelan put her arms under Marjorie and carefully started to lift her from the ground. Upon the slightest movement, Marjorie immediately started to squirm and utter exclamations of pain from behind her gritted teeth. Yelan just did her best to ignore the sounds, making careful haste of evacuating the building, back out into the open air of what used to be Mondstadt City. Once she was outside and safe from any further danger, she placed Marjorie down slowly and began to perform first aid on her most major injury. A jagged fragment of her tibia was sticking out of her right leg, and upon further examination, found that her right knee was dislocated as well. Yelan guessed that she had been standing when she was buried by the debris and had fallen wrongly, causing this trauma to occur in the collapse. She couldn't just leave these two injuries without first aid, so she worked quickly to find some ways to temporarily treat the injuries. The first order of business was getting the compound fracture wrapped tight to prevent infection or further damage. Therefore, seeing she had nothing but her weapon and clothes on her, she stripped herself of her top, planning to use it as a bandage. To avoid anything bacterial getting into the opening of the wound, Yelan turned her attire inside out and prepared to wrap it tight around Marjorie's leg. "This is gonna hurt like crazy, but I need you to stay as still as possible," she warned, holding a stern look.
I'll try my hardest,"
Marjorie replied shakily. "All right, take a deep breath and find yourself a happy place in 3, 2, 1. Upon the last command, Yelan started to wrap the injury tightly, causing Marjorie to tense up hard and grunt in pain. Her eyes were shut tight and her teeth were gritted so hard that it showed just how much agony she was enduring with every individual wrap of Yelan's attire. She wrapped it 3 times, then finished by tying the ends into a double knot, making sure it was sturdy enough and that it wouldn't come loose. However, Marjorie's hell wasn't over yet, because now came the second task of shifting her knee back into position. Yelan wasn't shy of this treatment, given she'd had a few cases of relocating bones in her past, both on herself and comrades. Therefore, she knew exactly what to do, and just how horrible the pain would be for Marjorie. "Okay, now I need you to take another deep breath for me, Marjorie," she instructed softly. "Your knee is out of place, so I need to get it back in place. It's going to hurt like hell, but it needs to be done if you ever want to walk normally again." Beads of sweat were rolling down Marjorie's face, and upon hearing the horrid task ahead, her eyes bulged.
"Please, just give me a second to recover,"
Marjorie pleaded. "It's only going to take me a second. and it's best to get it done now, seeing I don't know how long it's been that way. Yelan countered. Unless you want to walk with a cane for the rest of your life, take a deep breath and scream when I say 1. Marjorie couldn't argue, so she just nodded and did as Yelan instructed, taking in a deep breath and preparing for the worst. Alright, I'm going to do it fast, Yelan said, positioning her hands in the proper spots to perform the task. 3, 2, 1, scream! Upon the last command, Yelan twisted Marjorie's leg in the proper direction to reposition the bone, a simultaneous cacophony of a very loud pop and Marjorie screaming like a banshee erupting into chaotic harmony. However, that symphony of absolute pain and madness lasted only for a few seconds, Marjorie's knee going back into socket and her nightmare ending. The madness had been enough to make Marjorie pass out, which Yelan knew wasn't anything to worry about. The 2 worst things were handled for now, so she turned back to searching for more survivors. Rest tight, Marjorie. I need to figure out what the hell happened here. She got back to her feet and turned to the street, resuming her search. She searched each building all the way up to the fountain, and unfortunately had only discovered the remains of Mondstadt citizens. Rummaging through the clutter had grown her to a fatigued state, stopping momentarily to catch her breath in front of Good Hunter. It killed her to stop searching, but she also knew that she couldn't kill herself searching either, so she made the logical choice. As she sat taking slow and easy breaths, she thought about her fellow comrades, now hundreds of miles away. The fact that Mondstadt had been attacked and destroyed scared her to no avail, and she hoped in her heart that they hadn't acted too late. She had no idea how long ago Mondstadt had been sieged, and if it had been days, the android responsible for this attack could be in Inazuma awaiting the command to attack. However, she was smart enough to know not to focus on what could be, and immediately removed any thoughts of Inazuma being next from her mind. Right now, she just needed to focus on one thing, figuring out what happened and finding any survivors. As she went to get to her feet to continue her pursuit, a sudden sound of footsteps met her ears, driving her to her feet and drawing back an arrow for an attack. She didn't move, and like a fisherman waiting patiently for a fish to bite their hook, waited for whoever was nearby to come to her. They were heavy footsteps, like combat boots, and they carried a sense of familiarity. While Yelan wasn't entirely sure if she was correct, she suddenly felt like she wasn't in danger and that the situation had changed. The steps drew within yards, and upon the reveal of who was walking, Yelan was relieved. Sir Diluc? She addressed, wondering if she was imagining this encounter, but upon his reply, it became clear that he was really there. He turned his gaze to her, armed with the same claymore that he'd armed the day of their capturing of Reshov. He was on edge and relieved upon seeing Yelan's face. Miss Yelan? He questioned, taking a second to regain his composure. I'll admit that you were the last person I expected to see among these runs. Yelan withdrew her weapon and walked to Diluc's position, both of them in shock that this encounter was even happening. I'm just glad to see you're still alive. Can you explain what the hell happened here? Of course. But first, I need to know where that scream came from. Yelan gasped, having forgotten her aiding of Marjorie's injuries amidst the shock of meeting up with an old ally. Oh, I came across a survivor named Marjorie. She's hurt really badly, but I managed to treat her injuries through the use of... Yelan paused, having completely forgot she had used her clothing to wrap the fracture, meaning She was standing in broad daylight with only her bra covering her upper body. She blushed instantly in embarrassment, feeling as if she were nude in a spotlight in her current position. However, Diluc calmed the situation by taking the initiative to shed his jacket and offer it as cover for Yelan. "Take this, Miss Yelan," he offered nicely, to which Yelan took with hesitation. While she was still embarrassed, she could respect Diluc for his kindness in sparing her any further exposure than she already had. She slipped on the warm leather jacket and worked quickly to cover her entire upper body, thanking him accordingly. Thank you, Sir Diluc. I'm very sorry you had to see me so, exposed." "It's no problem, Miss Yelan. After all, it's thanks to your sacrifice that one of our own will live to see another day. Now, where is she?" Yelan didn't waste any further time and led Diluc to Marjorie, still passed out like a light. Diluc did the honors of picking her up carefully and followed with only one more thing that would answer all of the questions on Yelan's mind. "Follow me, and I'll answer any questions you may have." The cathedral door echoed upon closing tightly, Diluc having led Yelan there with Marjorie in tow. Upon entering the long and open infrastructure of the building, both familiar and unfamiliar faces were met by Yelan's gaze. At the other end, the sight of Jean, Barbara, and a passed-out Lisa came into view, and off to the side were two strangers. The first was a lady that resembled a witch with two long pigtails adorned with astronomical fixtures attached to their ends. The second was a bard with piercing teal eyes and two short braids with teal-dyed ends that hung off both sides of their head. Both of them were in disarray, showing that they'd both experienced trauma recently, as much as loss. Upon Diluc's approach, the bard was the first to speak. "We've got another survivor!" They spoke frantically. "Sister Barbara, get into position quickly!"
On it!
Barbara responded, hurrying to meet Diluc.
"How is she?"
Diluc didn't answer immediately, only worked to gently place Marjorie into Barbara's arms. "She's stable, but badly hurt. It's best you get her healed as fast as you can."
"Yes, sir,"
she answered, carefully escorting Marjorie to a proper healing spot. Yelan could tell that the situation was serious just by the fact that she hadn't been recognized. Her curiosity was burning for answers to what had happened, so she continued down the aisle, coming to a stop in front of Jean.
"Miss Yelan?
Jean stated in surprise.
Are you hurt? Do I need to assign you for a heal?"
Yelan shook her head, responding quickly with assurance that she was unharmed. "No need to worry. I'm fine. I was on my way back from Inazuma, but once I saw the smoke, I ran here as fast as I possibly could to help. Can I ask exactly what happened to cause all of this?"
"Of course. However, allow me to introduce you to these people first."
She turned her head in the direction of the bard and witch, taking steps towards them both. Her approach caught both of their attentions, to which Jean gave the proper proceedings.
"Ms. Yelan, this is Mona Magistus, Mondstadt's local astrologist, and a main reason we are alive,"
Jean stated, gesturing towards the female witch.
"A pleasure to make your acquaintance,"
Mona greeted. Yelan nodded as a way of greeting Mona, allowing Jean to move to introducing the bard.
"And this is Venti. However, it's best you address them by their proper identity as..."
She paused shortly, causing Yelan to become confused. But upon the identity being revealed, she understood exactly why Jean had been so nervous.
Lord Barbatos.
Yelan's eyes bulged. Barbatos? As in, the god of freedom? Oh, Grandmaster, there's no need for such pleasantries. Barbatos said in a casual tone, surprising Yelan. Just call me Venti. My archon name is such a thing of the past, and I'd rather not be associated with it. It was as if he were just a regular person, but Yelan had a hard time believing a god could be so carefree and humble. She respected his wishes, though, and carefully chose her next words. A pleasure to meet you, Venti. See, no need to be so formal, Grandmaster Jean. He stated. Anyway, what's your name, ma'am?
You may call me Yelan.
Yelan confirmed, still in disbelief that she was talking to the animal archon. Nice to meet you, Miss Yelan. He greeted politely. With introductions concluded, Jean resumed the original request she'd promised to grant, sighing before starting.
All right, now that we are all acquainted, could you two explain what happened to lead to all of this to Miss Yelan?
Of course.
Mona accepted.
I'll start, seeing it's important you know exactly how we are all still alive, despite Mondstadt's current state.
Her gaze moved to the floor, revealing to Yelan that whatever she was about to hear had left trauma scars for Mona.
It all began with the nightmares.
3 days earlier. Mona shot up from her slumber, her eyes bulged and breaths rapid. She had just awoken from a nightmare she'd been having for the past few nights, but this time it had been something more extreme. A nightmare so vivid in detail that it had felt like more than just a regular nightmare. It had been as if it were reality, and upon eyeing the person who had awoken her, she had known in her every thought that it hadn't been just a bad dream, became all the more true. Lisa had a look similar to a worried mother when their child gets seriously hurt. She had been sweating, nearly crying, and had looked so scared as if Mona had sounded like she had been dying in her sleep. This had been the fourth nightmare. It had all started as a tame dream about her being locked in her house on fire with no escape 3 days prior. It had been your usual nightmare that ended with her waking up before the flames could reach and burn her to death. A spectacle that had scared her, but she'd waved it off as nothing more than a night scare. Nightmares like these were common, and the result of being under heavy amounts of stress. Being an astrologist, Mona was constantly under stress and fatigue, so she didn't see it as anything abnormal up until the next night. It was the same dream, except it hadn't started the same. Instead, it had started with her doing her usual habits prior to bedtime, reading and studying. However, it quickly became more familiar upon her finishing her nightly rituals and returning to slumber, only to wake to her house ablaze in flames. From there, it played out exactly the same, up until she was kicked from slumber and awoken. Again, dreams repeating wasn't anything new, so she'd written it off as nothing but a hint that she needed to take time off from her studies. Then came the third night. The dream started out differently again, this time beginning with her buying goods from the local produce stand. However, something odd occurred upon her departure just out of the corner of her eye. She spotted an odd-looking figure just outside of the Goth Grand Hotel. While it was a faint glimpse, she was sure she had seen two specific things: a top hat and red raven masquerade mask. By the time she had turned, nobody with such a description was anywhere to be seen, so she had waved it off as just a figment of her imagination and went home. From there, the dream played out from where it had started the second night, and followed with the same exact events to the point of where she was roused from slumber. That had been the point where Mona had started to speculate that these recurring dreams were more than just that. So upon the following day, she started to look around for any clues that may lead her to whatever the hell these nightmares were trying to tell her. She searched Lisa's library for all literature based around dreams, and after hours of endless research, found one specific thing that may have related to her situation. Premonitions. Several cases of reoccurring nightmares being warnings of real things to come had been recorded in history, but there was only one thing all of her nightmares shared: the fire. What did these other dreams that had given her more insight have to do with that specific aspect? Then she had remembered a key detail of her third one: the mysterious figure out of the corner of her eye. The top hat. The raven mask. That was when she had turned to the shelves of the library for something else. Information on the mask and if it had any connection to the fire in her dream. She searched for hours up until she had grown exhausted and returned back to her home with her hoard of knowledge. Too tired to read any further, Mona had gone to sleep, only to meet another horrid nightmare. The fourth one had started completely different, having begun with a whole different scenery. She had been standing outside the borders of Liyue Harbor, now nothing more than a smoldering mass of ruins submerged into the sea. Mona had been confused up until she was suddenly grabbed by someone from behind, and a sudden rapid succession of scenes had flashed before her eyes. It had been terrifying, having ended with her in her home, once again ablaze in flames with no exit in sight. Just like the rest, the dream had ended before the flames could reach her, having led to her waking up and hyperventilating in absolute fear. Now she had known something wasn't right, so she had gotten up and started to investigate the books on what she'd hoped was related to the figure she had seen. After hours of nothing, Mona had grown hungry for a lunch at Good Hunter, so she had departed for a short break. Luckily, the line hadn't been too long, so she'd requested and received her serving in little time, Mona having enjoyed her meal slowly and properly. However, just as she had gotten up to pay for her food, something eerie had struck her. Just out of the corner of her eye, she'd seen a figure with the same details as in her dream, causing her to quiver in mild fright. It had only gotten more creepy upon her having turned to see whoever had been haunting her sleep for the past 4 nights, only to see nothing. That alone had been enough for her to get up and run back home, having felt as if she were being watched. To settle her paranoia, Mona had decided to take a nice hot bath, having hoped for it to rid her psyche of those terrifying nightmares and allow her to get a good night's sleep. Once the wooden tub had filled with what she had hoped to be her solution to her troubles, she had stripped to nothing but her birthday suit and had soaked in the water for a long hour before getting out. After the bath, Mona had dressed herself in nothing but her bathrobe and had returned to doing her usual astrological studies, up until night had come. She hadn't cared to dress into anything and had retired to slumber with nothing but her flesh on, having hoped that maybe a bare sleep along with the long hot bath would have been enough to get a full night's rest. That had been proven null and void, upon her having awoken to her home ablaze yet again, no exit having been in sight. She'd risen from the bed in a haste, having wrapped her nude body up in the bathrobe just off to the side of the bed. She had attempted to douse the flames with her hydro attacks, but the raging blaze had already grown too powerful for any amount of water to dissolve them to nothing but cinders. It had been vivid, terrifying, traumatizing. However, it had only gotten worse upon her noticing she hadn't been alone. Just a few yards across from her had been the very figure she had seen in her previous nightmares, his head adorned with the same top hat, and his face covered by a blood-red raven masquerade mask with golden linings along the curves. Behind the mask, she had been able to see their eyes as well, their pupils being black and outlined with crimson scleras. They had been piercing, feeling as if they'd been stabbing the core of her soul to nothing but fragments of lifeless remains of what used to be her. She couldn't move. It had been as if she were petrified. The figure had suddenly grabbed her left shoulder with a force so powerful that it could have rivaled a god's strength, lifting her up above him and forcing her to look him in the eye. She had protested and tried to break free, but it would have only caused more damage. She had been absolutely sure her shoulder was broken, but all of the pain and fear she'd felt in that moment alone had been muted to silence by his one and only set of words. For the greater good, a new world shall be born from her ashes. After he'd finished saying that, Mona had been flung back to reality upon being thrown into the flames, her bathrobe coming off in the process. The flames embracing her skin had immediately caused her to scream in pain, having been unable to move or attempt to escape her searing agony. The pain had become numb to her over the long several minutes of having wished for death to greet and free her from the blaze drowning her, the smell of burning flesh and hair having permeated her senses to a point of suffocation. Having become numb to the pain and ready to escape, she had collapsed and closed her eyes in surrender, only to have been awoken from slumber by Lisa and leading to where she currently sits in a terrified state trying to catch her breath. Upon seeing Lisa's face, Mona was absolutely sure she had been screaming in her sleep, disrupting the library's usual quiet ambience. Not only that, her eyes were also moist and puffy, proving that she had been crying as well. That dream had been too real for her to just go home and rest. Now she definitely knew that her dreams had been trying to tell her something. She had felt the burns, her shoulder being crushed, and knew that the words the figure had said were not just a random manifestation of her psyche. Something was amiss. Therefore, she decided to bite the bullet and relay this information to Lisa, knowing that she couldn't solve this alone.
Mona, are you all right?
Lisa asked worriedly.
You were not only screaming as if you were in serious pain, but you're also sweating horribly.
Mona attempted to catch her breath, using a free hand to wipe away the sweat pouring from her forehead. Her face was drenched so badly that it had stained her glove, furthering clarification that her dream had been something else beyond just a dream. She worked quickly to calm down, managing to reach a stable condition after a couple minutes of performing proper tactics to calm herself down. This was by far the worst reaction she'd ever had to a nightmare in her entire life, which gave her the initiative to finally start explaining to Lisa why she'd ended up like this in the first place.
I need your help. Something isn't right, and my reoccurring nightmares over the past 3 nights have been trying to tell me something.
Lisa raised an eyebrow in confusion, having not expected that to be Mona's answer of all things. However, she decided to listen, due to the fact that Mona had clearly experienced something drastic before waking up.
What do you mean?
Lisa answered, hoping to get more details that would give her a better idea of Mona's situation. Mona then proceeded with explaining all that had occurred over the past 3 nights, making sure to include every detail to assure Lisa that she wasn't just making up nonsense. When she concluded the full explanation of her traumatic predicament, Lisa looked pale in the face. Being a witch herself, she knew some of the particular occurrences that some may face, and she'd heard of something similar to Mona's case before.
All right. I think I know what's happening,
Lisa answered, causing Mona to gasp in surprise.
However,
if this is what I'm assuming, I fear that Mondstadt might be in danger.
Mona gulped at that, partially not wanting to know what may be the truth. However, the fact that it risked Mondstadt's safety made her just continue to listen.
I fear that you are experiencing a precognition, and considering you are an astrologist with connections to fate and destiny, the messages could appear less as fantasies and more like actual reality. If you could actually feel the burns and have a dream inside of another dream, I believe it's a clear message or warning from fate itself. Therefore, I suggest you check your scryglass for actual confirmation.
Mona didn't have any better ideas and knew well that Lisa had made a great analysis. Just like a gnosis allows gods to have connections to Celestia, she, having the knowledge and abilities of an astrologist, has connections to fate, destiny, and the universe. That could explain why her nightmares were so vivid and realistic, as much as point out that Lisa was correct with checking her scryglass for proper confirmation. She decided to try it, hoping that nothing irregular or malicious would cross her path during the reading.
Alright, I'll try it.
Mona agreed, getting up into a proper posture to assure an accurate reading. She summoned her scryglass with no issues and started to analyze, only to quickly become horrified at what she was seeing. Fire, destruction, deaths of hundreds, Mondstadt in ruins after the dust settled. Everything was beginning to make sense, and upon closing her scryglass, she turned to Lisa with a look of horror painted on her face.
We must warn Acting Grandmaster Jean and the Knights of Favonius immediately. Mondstadt will be attacked and destroyed in 2 days. We must prepare for a counterattack. From there, Lisa and I went straight to Jean and explained everything. After that, Jean informed Kaya and several others of the impending doom, and we managed to build a good defense plan against the attack. However, the attack was much more severe than we'd expected, leading to countless casualties and damage. Up until a saving grace finally arrived to end the chaos.
Mona finished, her eyes averting from Yelan to Venti, signaling that it was his turn to start speaking. He caught the message, and with a nod, resumed where Mona had left off.
I had been resting at the Windrise tree when I spotted the plume of black smoke rising from Mondstadt. As their god, I immediately rushed back to the city, only to see an endless amount of fire and chaotic warfare. What shocked me was that there were only 3 enemies fighting against Mondstadt's army of hundreds, yet they were somehow holding off all the attacks as if it were nothing but a scratch.
That's because they aren't human. Yelan intervened, causing Venti to jump in surprise.
What do you mean?
These are the same beings that attacked and ended Liyue Harbor's existence. They're machines fueled by the energy of the gods that can absorb elemental power and use it to enhance their strength and abilities beyond that of even a god's. They were created by the Tsaritsa and are being used to wipe out the existence of archons and their nations in hopes of recreating the world in a whole new way. The only way to kill them is by brute force or natural combat. Vision-infused attacks cannot be used against them. Otherwise, you will likely die in seconds. Venti was slightly shaking in fear, completely dumbfounded by what he had just heard.
So, the Tsaritsa was responsible.
Jean interrupted.
I feared that Mona's vision had something to do with the attack on Liyue Harbor, so I had ordered all of our soldiers that possess visions to not use them in our defense. It seems my intuition saved Mondstadt from extinction. But regardless, we still lost many lives.
Don't blame yourself, Grandmaster, Yelan stated comfortingly. It's because of you and all of your knights that Mondstadt will live to see another day.
while many were lost, their deaths weren't in vain, because all of you are still here, alive and well. While Jean was still hurt from the losses, a smile graced her lips at Yelan's words, knowing her comrade was right. Therefore, she expressed a look of assurance and said one thing. "Thank you, Miss Yelan. I needed to hear that." Yelan nodded with her own smile, allowing Venti an opening to speak further on the events of what had occurred. "Anyway, the battle had appeared to me as a stalemate, and I knew I couldn't beat them. As a veteran of war, and having witnessed battles of high magnitudes, I knew I was outmatched. However, I knew one thing that could beat them, so I called them with a simple strum of my lyre. While he had originally retired from affairs of battle and relations to my duties as Archon, Dvalin couldn't watch the people of Mondstadt die. Those monsters were no match for an elemental dragon, and were defeated in no more than 3 attacks." Yelan gasped at that, shocked at the fact that these supposedly indestructible androids had easily been defeated with little effort by the elemental dragon of wind. A spark of hope erupted in her chest, starting to finally see a potential way to defeat the Tsaritsa. "I have one question, Venti." "Huh? What is it?" "During the entire duration of the elemental dragon's attacks, did it exhume any elemental energy?" "Of course. Dvalin used gusts to attack and kill them. The force was too powerful for them to handle, and the impacts of the attack shut them down instantly." Yelan nodded with a wide smile. "Thank you for confirming. Now I know that they can't absorb elemental dragon energy, and that's a perfect advantage against the Tsaritsa." Upon that statement, everyone became fully aware of Yelan's hypothesis and exactly what she was going to say next. "Venti, I hate to say this, but this won't be the last attack, and as long as you remain free to roam, you will always be in danger. Also, this attack doesn't just involve Mondstadt, but all of Teyvat. And until we stop the Tsaritsa, this will just keep happening." "I know, Miss Yelan. Otherwise Liyue Harbor would still exist. I know exactly what you're saying, but must regret to inform you that what you are requesting is not my choice to make." "I already knew that. So tell me what it will take to get Dvalin on our side of the matter we're all facing." Venti took a moment to pause and think, and upon collecting his thoughts to a point of being able to deliver Yelan a rational answer, spoke his response. "You need to persuade and give him a reasonable motive to fight for the entirety of Teyvat." The day had come, and it was clear as day that something major was on the horizon to all in attendance inside the Kamisato estate. The plan on Ganyu, Ayaka, and Keqing's end had changed slightly, seeing going door to door and forcing potentially innocent people out into the rain seemed kind of wrong. Therefore, the plan had simply changed for the 3 to wait for the enemies to show themselves, seeing if one went down, it would likely lead to a call for reinforcements. While it wasn't their first time, Ganyu and Keqing still trembled at the thought of confronting the very monsters that had nearly taken their lives the night Liyue Harbor and the Tianquan went into the ocean for the rest of eternity. This was something they knew would eventually come to pass, but now that it was here, the 2 survivors of that dreadful night were scared to even move from their seats. The atmosphere of the vicinity was tense and heavy, as if their shoulders were stacked with 2-ton lead blocks. They'd just finished what could have been their last meals, and in hopes of mentally preparing themselves for whatever lied ahead, they'd taken a moment to just take it all in. However, that had only led to a sudden onset of primal fear,
feeling as if a needle had injected ice into their veins and had taken their breath away instantly. But this wasn't the moment for them to surrender to their trauma, and they both knew that clearly. They'd recover, but it would take a minute of reassuring themselves that they could conquer their greatest fears. The silence, as still as a predator's footsteps in the action of stalking prey, was finally seized by the sound of Ganyu's voice.
"Are you scared, my love?"
She practically whispered amongst the quiet of the Kamisato estate. Keqing usually wasn't the type to admit her true feelings, but because it was Ganyu, she knew that she could be honest without any worry of humiliation. After all, she too was there the night this true fear was planted into her psyche.
"Terrified."
Keqing responded in a shaky whisper.
"It's okay. I am too."
Keqing met Ganyu's gaze, her words giving a sense of comfort amongst the heaviness weighing down on her shoulders. She didn't know why, but for some reason, she had the urge to start crying. However, she held back her tendencies and instead took a deep breath and let it out slowly before saying another word.
"Ganyu, can I ask you something?"
Ganyu winced curiously at the question, but she just nodded her head in response.
"Absolutely."
Keqing paused before speaking again, allowing herself a second to think clearly on how to word her response.
Do you really think we can do this? Be honest with me."
That was a question that Ganyu hadn't expected, and she knew exactly how Keqing wanted her to answer it. She wanted her to give her a true answer, not a response of reassurance or comfort.
"I understand what you're saying, and my answer is yes. Because I know I must do this to protect the people of Inazuma from suffering the same fate that our home did. There's simply no other option in my mind."
Keqing sighed, admiring her beloved's mindset. It was something she wished she had, but after nearly facing death, Keqing had learned just how weak she was to this enemy, and it had played with her ever since she had awoken the next day in Wangshu Inn.
"That's great to know. But now it's my turn to be honest. I've never told you this, but ever since that night, I've been unable to accept that I'm strong enough to defeat these monsters. I've tried to ignore and pretend it was only my mind playing tricks on me, but I can't deny the truth anymore. I couldn't beat one of these things even if my life depended on it. I may be a sword master and will fight tooth and nail to protect everything that I love, but in the end, unlike you, I'm only human. Please don't think I'm abandoning you and Inazuma because while I'm terrified, just like you, I know what I must do. I'm mainly saying this because I want you to know how I truly feel about this."
Ganyu's heart ached at the confession, but she couldn't deny that Keqing was correct about one thing. Humans can't overpower the strength of the gods. However, she already knew what to say, because while her beloved was right about one thing, she was missing one key difference in their current mission.
While I can't deny that a god's strength is much greater than a human's, I can say this. Part of me is human too, and because I am only half Adeptus, I know that while humans cannot be a god alone, they can overcome anything together with the ones they love. I've witnessed this both as of late and while I fought in the Archon War. Lady Ningguang could not have saved Liyue Harbor from both Osile and Baish without the support of all of those who would stand and fight by her side. Nobody can beat a force like that without support on the battlefield, and this time, I'll be by your side against these monsters.
Keqing's gaze met Ganyu's again, realizing that her love was right. she wouldn't be alone out there. No, this time she would have support along with the strength of the bond she'd forged over the past weeks. She smiled in relief, feeling all the weight on her shoulders lift.
You're right. I'm so sorry I didn't realize that. It's okay, my love. People don't think clearly when they're scared. As you said, you're only human, and humans are very vulnerable under the influence of fear. I promise to protect you no matter what. Tonight, we mustn't falter under fear of the past. Otherwise, the Tsaritsa has already won. Then I promise to fight without fear. I'm glad to hear that.
The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ayaka, her face spelling that it was time to begin.
The Shogun has left Tenshukaku for Guji-Yai,
she informed.
It's time for us to move into Inazuma City for the next phase of the plan.
Ganyu and Keqing both nodded in agreement, getting up to their feet and arming themselves with their weapons. It was time to face their greatest fears.
Then let's go and take these bastards out,
Keqing stated as an exclamation that she intended to keep her promise. No more fear. No more trauma. They'd have to battle with all of their strength to overcome the very thing that had started this entire mess. And as Ganyu and Keqing followed Ayaka out of the Kamisato estate, that was all that was on their minds. While A and Miko did their part on one side of Narukami Island, Ganyu and Keqing met up with Kokomi on the outskirts of the southern end for a last-minute rendezvous. It wouldn't be until sunset that A would initiate the storm to draw out the cockroaches potentially hiding amongst the people of Inazuma. Therefore, they decided to take that time to run over the plan one last time. Being a person of heavy stature and knowledge on the battlefield, Kokomi had revised their entire part of the plan as if it were a script she'd had to memorize for a play. To put it into a brief description, Kokomi's part was to simply survey the beaches during the storm and submit anyone that attempted to leave. Several of her soldiers were stationed on each corner of the island, disguised as a common Inazuma resident to avoid suspicion. Over the days of preparation for the mission, Kokomi had taken the initiative to try and mimic what she and the 3 survivors of Liyue Harbor's termination had discussed in secrecy. She devised a weapon that looked similar to a smoke bomb and had armed each of her fellow soldiers with them. They acted more like grenades, containing 2 substances that, when applied with friction and rapid contact with one another, created a nasty reaction that would cause an explosion. Not only that, it also created an electrical solution that causes mild electrocution to anyone who comes into contact with it. Something practically close enough to suffice until Yelan's return. While Yelan's absence of over 3 days had caused worry amongst Ganyu and Keqing, they knew they couldn't let that stop them from protecting Inazuma. The Fatui wouldn't wait for Yelan to return before acting, so that meant they couldn't wait either. What mattered was the present situation, not what may be happening overseas. Ganyu and Keqing both knew that, and upon seeing the sun fall below the horizon, they knew it was time for action. They were currently stationed in Komori Tea House, Ayaka having left 5 minutes prior to take her position in the northern end of Inazuma City. Ganyu was next, assigned to take the east end up high, her class as an archer being the reason for the elevated vantage point. Keqing would take the south 5 minutes after Ganyu's departure, and once the 15 minutes passed after the fall of sunset, A would manifest and start the downpour. Knowing it was time for her to go, Ganyu gave her beloved a goodbye kiss and some words of reassurance that this wouldn't be their last moment together.
I'll see you soon.
Keqing gripped her beloved's hand in care, answering with her own words of clarity that she knew they'd meet again when the sun rose again.
Until we meet at the first sign of a new day.
Ganyu nodded with a smile, Then, with Amo's bow in her grasp and her vision confiscated until the dust settled, took her leave with confidence in her steps. Upon hearing the door to Komori Tea House shut, Keqing averted her gaze to her lap, a sheathed lion's roar nestled across her thighs. She then followed by sliding the light blade out of its home of leather, up until the sword still and closest to the grip, being tightly sheltered by her right hand, revealed a reflection of herself. Her violet eyes stared back at her with a flurry of emotions, starting to recollect the night that the weapon before her saved her from assured death. She remembered it all vividly, the screams of the people calling for help, right before the doors to Jinyu kiosk blew off their hinges, and all she could hear was the ringing in her ears. Out of pure instinct, she'd pulled Lion's Roar from its position on her right hip to shield herself from the debris, and thanks to that act, she'd managed to suffer only a few burns. However, the act that had saved her life was when the android she'd faced had launched an attack towards her right arm that would have surely taken it clean off. Again, her instincts and skills as a swordmaster paid off, having managed to throw her blade in front of the strike and decrease the amount of damage that the attack would have done, had she not managed to block it. While the android had won her over in terms of strength, the damage she'd taken was a broken leg and a laceration from her weapon that went 3 inches deep into her right shoulder socket and extended to the base of her right breast. Had Ganyu not found her, due to her inability to walk or defend herself, she would have sunk and perished along with Liyue Harbor. That night, she'd been reduced to the equivalent of a defenseless animal that couldn't save or protect itself, and this time, she refused to lose to these machines of genocide. Never again. This time, we will beat these bastards. Then, after we achieve victory here, next is the Tsaritsa's head. She slid her sword back into the sheath and started to her feet. Her recollection of the night that she'd gotten the closest to death than ever before, having taken up the entire 5 minutes she'd had to wait out. It was a moment of remembrance she'd needed to gain the strength to face the very same enemy that had nearly sent her to the clouds above. It was time for redemption. With her strength restored and sword by her side, Keqing started to the exit of Komori Tea House and stepped out into the empty streets of Inazuma City. Upon meeting the cool air of the night, Keqing felt a sense of peace come over her body. It was as if a tranquility had suddenly washed over her, her demons and greatest fears now at rest in her mind. She was ready to face the Tsaritsa's creations once again. Time to go to work. She finished, starting for the south end of the city as she saw a group of thunderclouds begin to form above her. As planned, 5 minutes after Keqing had departed from Komori Tea House, Inazuma had become drenched in rainfall. This hadn't been Ganyu or Keqing's first time fighting in the rain, so the monsoon caused them no distraction or personal issues. Same case was with Ayaka as well, having had several training sessions during downpours, resulting in her becoming more agile and cautious of her surroundings while in the heat of battle. The first 5 minutes of the storm were eerily quiet and calm, but the three didn't drop their guard for even a second, paying attention to every bit of their visible surroundings. Ganyu by far had the best view for anything abnormal, having taken position atop one of Inazuma's main buildings. She could see all of the city, along with the festival off in the distance, and being a veteran of the Archon War, knew what to spot as abnormal occurrences on the battlefield. So far, aside from her bangs mildly obscuring her vision, everything seemed fine. However, she knew just how tricky enemies could be. And one of those tactics was easily making you drop your guard out of assumption that nothing was wrong. It was a maneuver that had taken the lives of several of her comrades in the past, so she remained as focused as a hawk stalking its prey. In the south, the same case was Keqing's as well, resting in an alleyway cloaking her with shadow. The ambience of the storm currently soaking her was strangely ominous amongst the still quiet acting as an eerie undertone. While the droplets embracing her clothed flesh were as cold as ice, she wasn't shivering, her rushing adrenaline being the cause. She was more focused than she'd ever been in her years as a swordmaster and hero to anyone she vowed to protect under oath. As for Ayaka, she was in a similar position as her fellow purple-haired comrade, resting under a sakura tree and listening sharply for any commotion beneath the static of rainfall. Being a swordmaster of the Kamisato arts, Ayaka was a force not to be reckoned with, having hearing as sharp as the pin of a needle and skills that most others couldn't even match. She had already obtained arts of the sword prior to obtaining her vision, hence why she wasn't afraid to fight without it. She could still cut down an enemy without her gift from the gods above, and that was something she had personally adopted for herself for situations as such. She couldn't rely on the gods' power forever, and had needed to train herself to fight with her blade without her vision's infusion. That time had come, and she knew full well that she was ready to defend her homeland. 20 minutes passed for the three warriors, everything having seemed normal in that time, up until something unexpected happened. A violent flash of violet light accompanied by the crack of lightning and booming of thunder shot down from the sky, landing towards the peak of Amakani Island, where A and Miko were stationed. That didn't sit right with Ayaka, Ganyu, or Keqing, knowing it had been a defensive attack. They also knew it was a beacon to signal the three that it was time for action, to which they could only answer with the action of entering full focus mode. The real battle had officially started, and all hell was about to break loose on Narukami Island. Ganyu was the first to move, standing up and beginning to navigate from rooftop to rooftop. She moved towards the open roads that led from Amakani Island to Inazuma City, knowing Kokomi and her army had the shores covered. She readied an arrow just in case, and upon looking out towards Amakani Island, she saw another ornery lightning bolt strike down like the crack of a whip. She remained at a high point to maintain a better view than on the ground level, keeping her eyes pinned to the main roadway for any movement. If one android had been compromised or submitted to a dead state, it would drive all of the other cockroaches out of hiding, most likely to rush to assistance. Out of the corner of her eye, another flash of ghostly light highlighted the night sky, only this time it came from the shores in the northeast. That meant that Ganyu's theory had been correct, and all of the pests were coming out of hiding. Speaking of the devil, just ahead of her, she caught sight of a person rushing for Amakani Island, sparks from interaction with rain visible. Ganyu didn't hesitate and took aim for the head, releasing the arrow as soon as she had a clear shot. The elongated mini-spear pierced right through the cranium of the android, dropping it like a rock upon full penetration, the rain following with the rest of the needed damage. Ganyu didn't celebrate though, knowing this was far from over, and instead followed with preparing another shot. More flashes accompanied the night from several directions, confirming that the majority had been hiding away underground. She could only hope that Kokomi could hold out the number of enemies, seeing there was no telling how many there were. She had her own fight, so she just turned her focus back to the streets, finding more people struggling to run due to short-circuiting. One by one, she fired more arrows, managing to hit their heads each time and subdue them to the wet ground. They all had been hiding in the buildings, up until the moment that lightning had struck Amakani Island, and out of being exposed and outsmarted, were now forced into the open. She was relieved that the Shogun had changed their plan now, saying it was working phenomenally well, and as she continued to navigate the roofs, took out anything that had visible sparks going off as a dead giveaway that they weren't human. More violent explosions of thunder and lightning added to the night, Inazuma beginning to look like a lightless battlefield as the war for Inazuma's safety continued to commence. Keqing had been met with her own fair share of enemies, having subdued them with her fast attacks and slashes of her sword. Unlike that night, this time she'd been without injury and could perform at her best ability, and even she'd surprised herself with how well she was handling herself against the enemy she'd previously feared. Her group of enemies had flooded from the direction of the beaches, proving there had been some hiding in the shelter of the underground caverns of the island. Same with Ganyu, they'd come out of nowhere after the first attack had gone off like a beacon of light, and she was enjoying every second of cutting these bastards down to where she'd been that night she'd nearly met death. Currently, she was throwing slash after slash as fast as she could against a group of easily 50 or more, but without elemental energy infusion, they were falling like flies. She hadn't taken one hit, and even against over 100 machines, was managing to keep herself from falling to fatigue or being overpowered by her greatest enemy. In fact, she hadn't felt this good in what felt like centuries. Being in the heat of battle again was like a drug to her, but she still knew her actual objective, and she kept it in mind with every single swing of her blade. She wouldn't stop until every one of these things were dead on the ground. As for Ayaka, she'd been met with her own group that had come from the direction of the Grand Narukami Shrine, and using every bit of her knowledge of combat with the sword, was tearing down every foe with little to no effort. It felt weird to fight without her vision, but that's why she'd trained herself for moments as such, and it was paying off. 50 turned to 40, then 40 turned to 20, up until there was little left. But as soon as she thought she could stop, more would come in bigger numbers. Again, she was ready for this, and this wasn't her first time dealing with a case as such. She'd fought many battles in her short life, whether it was hilly trolls, treasure hoarders, or more recently, the Raiden Shogun's own forces. Therefore, she had the strength and experience to fight several mobs of enemies without a single bead of sweat seeping from her pores. Even if it took all night or longer, she'd swing and cut down enemies with her blade until there was no more to attack. And she did. They all did. Ganyu shot hundreds of arrows. Keqing swung her sword thousands of times. Ayaka struck down her enemies hundreds of times to the point of exhaustion. Up until there was no more, and the three had unintentionally met back up on the battlefield. The flashing of lightning and Kokomi's squad's bombs exploding with an electric force finally went static in the darkness, and for just a moment, they felt like they could stop and breathe. However, as soon as they tried to do so, something made them rise to attention. The sound of a distant boom that echoed amongst the chaos. Huh? Keqing muttered, mainly out of exhaustion and surprise. It wasn't over. But there was no remaining androids within any perimeter of Narukami Island. So, what was left? Then, like a firework, a light adorned the black of the night, appearing first as nothing more than a pinprick high in the sky, then expanding into a larger size upon getting closer. Upon the three turning to the sight in the sky, they immediately rushed to get out of the way. Incoming fire! Get to safety, you two! Ayaka demanded, knowing the incoming attack would cause massive damage upon impact. Ganyu and Keqing gasped in shock, following with doing exactly what they'd been told, running as fast as possible to get out of the line of fire. They'd managed to do so with good time, the now confirmed fireball landing with a massive boom and destroying several of the surrounding buildings. Smoke, fire, and rubble littered the streets instantly, making Ganyu, Keqing, and Ayaka want to make attempts to prevent the growing inferno from spreading further. However, the three didn't have time to put the fires out, knowing only more attacks were coming. What the hell is this? Keqing exclaimed in frustration.
can't fight us on the land, so they attack from the sea?
That's exactly what it is,
Ayaka stated.
Our enemy is much smarter than we thought. Everything we just encountered was merely a decoy to waver down our strength, so that when they brought out the actual enemy, we'd be easy targets.
Another subtle boom erupted from out beyond the shores, causing Ayaka to speak fast, knowing everything had officially changed drastically.
Run!
Ayaka demanded, quickly leading Ganyu and Keqing out of the city towards Konda village. Their only advantage was that they could dodge the attacks easily, but other than that, they were sitting ducks against the massive balls of fire. Something Ayaka made clear upon stopping just before the entrance to Konda village.
As much as I hate to say it, we can't fight a foe like this in our current position,
Ayaka directed.
Then, what do we do now?
Ganyu questioned.
We need to rendezvous with the Shogun and hope that Miss Kokomi can hold out on the shores. We can't go back to the city to attempt or lessen the damage, nor can we navigate to the shores to help. We need to rethink our plan and come up with a new strategy before Inazuma becomes nothing but smoldering debris.
As much as the two didn't want to admit it, Ayaka was right. Therefore, they accepted the momentary surrender with a bitter taste in their mouths and nodded in agreement.
Thank you,
Ayaka stated.
Now, follow me to Amakani Island and stay sharp. We still have no idea what the situation is like on their side.
With Ayaka leading the way, the three ladies rushed as fast as their legs could run to the sealed-off Amakani Island, the status inside being calm in comparison to the other end of the spectrum. The storm within had been seized, unlike the outside, and the likely traumatized attendees of the island were sitting in a mix of conditions. Some were standing with puzzled looks, while others were tending to children and their fellow kin. A positioned shogunate soldier spotted the three soaked comrades, and after running off to fetch A, were granted entry within the safety of the barrier. The shogun was surprised at their presence, having expected them to be fighting in the city area. However, once she saw their faces, she immediately knew something was wrong.
What is going on?
A asked with worry in her voice. Ayaka took the initiative, having been the one to make the call to temporarily abandon their prior mission.
Forgive us for leaving our position, Your Grace, but there's a major problem.
Ayaka started.
The first wave of enemies all three of us faced and eliminated were nothing but dupes designed to tire us dry of strength. Now, the Fatui have taken the offensive with the real threat, and as we speak, are attacking Inazuma with large masses ablaze with fire.
What? A exclaimed out of surprise, having not expected the Fatui to resort to such a brutal method. Ayaka just continued to add more salt to the wound by addressing further the reasoning of their current arrival.
We cannot do anything offensively and are sitting ducks in the city. So, we have chosen to regroup with you and Guji Yai in hopes of finding an answer to this tactic.
A was infuriated, but knew her emotions were not important in the current situation. She needed to think fast, seeing Inazuma was currently being reduced to nothing but shambles, so she took a deep breath to calm down.
I understand, and do not blame anything on you, Miss Kamisato,
A assured.
Turns out these bastards are much smarter than we thought, and that's a major issue. How are Miss Kokomi's forces holding out on the beaches?
Ayaka shook her head as a way of answering.
We had no time to check, Your Grace,
Ayaka answered in a tone of defeat.
We had to evacuate immediately or risk getting trapped by the stacking clutter and fire.
Raiden nodded in assurance.
Understood.
A took a moment to think, juggling her thoughts quickly for an answer. It took a second, but eventually she found a solution. A risky one.
All right, I see only one solution then. You said that the target was Inazuma City, correct? Affirmative.
Ayaka answered.
Good. Buildings and structures can be rebuilt with time, so the damage can be atoned for. Now, I need to know two things. What directions were the projectiles being shot from, and how frequently were they being launched? The east, and the fire frequency was relatively low, meaning there's probably only one ship launching the attacks?
She was catching on.
All right, then come with me to the east beaches.
Raiden answered.
It will take a good amount of my strength, but I will show these foes what it means to challenge the might of lightning.
Almost immediately, Miko intervened on the idea of practical self-sacrifice.
Hold it, eh?
Yae demanded in a voice that carried the same amount of intimidation as a drill sergeant.
If you think I'm going to just let you go and throw your life into the Tsaritsa's hands, you've got another thing coming. I understand how you feel, but draining yourself dry of energy isn't going to solve anything. Then what else do you want me to do, Miko?
A shot back.
If we don't act fast, the entire city is going to be destroyed, and unless we use elemental power, we cannot reach the devices currently threatening our home. What else is there to do? Have you forgotten what I am as much as what I can summon to help?
Yae countered.
All of the kitsune of Inazuma are at my call, and I highly doubt they'll stand idly by and watch their home be destroyed. Not to mention, while I'd rather these three not even see it, I can manifest into my own kitsune form at any time. These androids are no match for ancient yokai that wouldn't hesitate to rip their heads off as payback for all this trouble.
At the mention of Yae having an alternative form, Ganyu jumped, remembering she too was part Adeptus. Like Yae, she'd rather not reveal said form, but the situation called for it. Therefore, she spoke up.
Pardon my interruption, but like Miss Yae, I too have an Adeptus form, and can transform at will.
Ganyu explained.
Perfect,
Yae said.
You see, eh? People are willing to assist you, even if it goes beyond their comfort zones. Stop being a prideful hothead and let us help you.
A sighed heavily, knowing she'd been beaten, and out of the clear severity of the situation, agreed.
All right. I apologize for my hasty recklessness. However, I can't leave you two to fend on your own. While your mythical beast forms are very powerful, you are still susceptible to fatal hits. Therefore, I will provide defense by using lightning to take out their devices, as much as make it easier for you not to get hurt. Now, there's the AI now,
Yae responded.
That's a plan I can actually agree with.
A didn't appreciate the sarcasm, but didn't have time to care.
All right. As for Miss Kamisato and the others...
Keqing intervened, already having a plan of action.
We'll assist Kokomi and her forces on the shores. She'll need as much help as possible, and we can't allow the ships to reach the shore.
A nodded in agreement, relieved that Yae had talked sense into her.
All right, let's hurry to the shores and pray that Miss Kokomi has outlasted the assault.
With no other word, the hopeful group started all the way across Narukami Island, navigating first to the western shores, then rounding the south end. Once they made it to the east, they eventually came to the site of Kokomi and her soldiers attempting to fire at the ships far out beyond the island's shoreline. However, their efforts were proving faulty, due to not having enough caliber to reach the target just visible about 100 yards out. But they weren't the focus. so at least they didn't have to worry about casualties or worse. Upon their approach, Kokomi instantly breathed a major sigh of relief, knowing now that her comrades were safe.
Oh, thank the gods you are all safe,
she said.
I was worried that you all had gotten caught in the line of fire.
How are things here, Miss Kokomi? A asked.
For the most part, we've held our ground well, minus some minor injuries to some of our soldiers,
Kokomi answered.
However, when they started firing at the city, I'm afraid there was really nothing we could do. We've attempted to damage the ships, but we can't reach.
Do not worry. You have done well, Raiden assured.
After some discussion,
we've resolved a way to hopefully end this for good.
Then I suggest you work fast. There's no telling how much damage has been done from these attacks.
Of course, A agreed, turning her attention to Yae and Ganyu. You two know what to do. Once you are changed, I'll prepare my part of the plan. Ganyu and Yae nodded in agreement, Yae following by pulling out her practical wand and starting the process of summoning her fellow kitsune. I suggest you prepare yourselves, she warned, her wand starting to glow and Yae closing her eyes. All of my fellow children of Narukami, I call upon thee in dire need. Your home is in peril, and only with your assistance can we save it from destruction. Please, answer my call to save everything we hold dear and its future to come. Upon the utterance of the desperate call for help, Yae opened her eyes. Her pupils radiated a bright light as hundreds of pink orbs began to manifest all around them. It was quite a sight to witness, and it only got more mesmerizing upon the orbs beginning to take form into something more animalistic. Hundreds of yokai came into full manifestation on the beach, causing everyone to understand instantly why Yae had warned them. Foxes, raccoons, and several more creatures surrounded all of them, all of different shapes, sizes, and ages. It brought back memories for Ganyu when she was still a child, before Cloud Retainer had taken her in as her own. Back then, Adepti used to flourish throughout her original home in packs as big as this one. However, her nostalgic thoughts were not important right now. She needed to focus on doing something she hadn't in centuries, changing forms.
Ugh, what's with the racket, Miko? I thought I told you that I didn't want to be involved in pointless nonsense like this anymore 100 years ago.
A more aged yokai exclaimed.
It's good to see you too, Raiko,
she greeted.
Why don't you look out there and see for yourself?
The mythical beast followed her pointed finger out beyond the shores, watching as yet another fireball was launched into the sky like a rocket.
What in the blazes do these miscreants think they're doing to our property?
He exclaimed.
I speak for everyone here that unless you want to keep your property, you'll do all you can to stop them from getting another shot off,
Yae directed.
Damn good for nothing, cretin! I'll teach you a lesson!
He finished, starting for the ship. Once the easily tempered yokai was out of range, Yae spoke up to the rest of her fellow kin.
I'd suggest you follow his lead. Otherwise, your home won't last much longer.
Count me in.
Another yokai that had the form of a fox and resembled a boxer accepted with absolute pride.
I've been wanting to spar for a while now, and will take pride in knocking these asses' heads from their shoulders.
It didn't take long for the many others to agree as well, having made it to the ship by the time Yae's turn had come to take form. Her transformation was quick and simple, having to only put her hands together, close her eyes, and in a flash of violet light, appeared as a large kitsune with 5 large tails. She was easily over 10 feet tall with pink fur and piercing violet eyes. It was quite the sight, but Ganyu's was something far more intimidating. Her transformation started the same, but unlike a flash of light, Ganyu's was slow and more similar to a werewolf's process from human to monster. She first started to grow tall and wide, her horns extending and thick light blue fur growing from every follicle of her body. Her nose and mouth extended into a muzzle, her hands and feet became hooves, and a long tail grew from the base of her spine. By the time she'd fully finished, she was over 30 feet tall, on all fours, and resembled something close to a lion. To say that Keqing was slightly intimidated by her beloved Qilin form was an understatement, even though she knew she had no reason to fear the massive creature before her. For Ganyu, she was surprised at how well she felt natural in this form, considering she hadn't been this way since the Archon War. It was relieving, even if she felt slightly embarrassed, preparing to go out and teach the Fatui a lesson they'll never forget.
Well, I definitely didn't expect her to be that tall. Think you can reach the ships from here?
Watch me,
Ganyu answered, following with jumping outward towards the target destination, launching over 100 feet into the air. Before taking off to join her, Yai stated one last thing.
You've sure got something special, Miss Keqing.
Then before Keqing could even respond, she started a steady pace of skipping elegantly across the water. While Keqing and the others stayed on the shore to provide help for Kokomi, Ganyu and Yai, along with the other yokai, raided the ship that had fired the projectiles. Ganyu had started her retaliation by landing and destroying the catapult with a single swipe of her massive tail. She'd managed to take out the Fatui manning the weapon as well, blood staining the fur dressing her left hoof. The yokai were all over the staff of the ship, not holding back on the hostile monsters that had nothing but malicious intent. Yai had joined them shortly, attacking and taking out any other Fatus foolish enough to take her on, while Ganyu continued to damage the ship with her godly strength. She rocked the ship and punched holes through its flooring, showing these bastards the price of everything they'd caused her, Keqing, and Yelan. Along with that was the several lightning bolts attacking the ship, controlled by A. They struck the exterior like a spiked whip, causing serious damage and killing whoever got hit by the electric jabs. The occupants of the vessel didn't stand a chance against the might and rage of a near 40-foot tall Adeptus beast, angry yokai, and the might of the goddess of lightning. However, the chaos was so frantic that Ganyu hadn't noticed that she was being targeted from afar, and hadn't realized it until a sound had graced her ears with enhanced hearing.
Ganyu! Watch out!
huh?
Before she could have even realized what she'd heard and who had said it, it was too late. A sudden impact of force to her left side that led to an agonizing amount of pain within her body had caused her to stagger so badly that the ship had become unbalanced. The vessel had begun to tip onto its right side, causing Ganyu and the others to fall into the water along with it. Luckily, the hundreds of mythical creatures were able to just reposition themselves atop the water, but Ganyu struggled to swim due to her injuries. The projectile that had struck her side had managed to fracture at least 3 of her ribs, making any movement agonizing for her. Despite the pain, Ganyu had managed to get a grip on the ship's body, but she was far from safe, the source of the unexpected attack coming into view. Less than 50 yards away was another ship armed with the same catapult, and they were readying another shot to either knock out Ganyu or kill her. She was a sitting duck. Yai rushed to her aid, hoping that the damage wasn't too severe.
Miss Ganyu, are you okay?
It took a second for Ganyu to answer, searing agony engulfing her entire body in her current situation.
No. My ribs. They're broken.
Yai had enough information to make the verdict. Ganyu couldn't fight anymore.
Down for the count. Just hang on to the ship for a little longer. My friends and I will take care of the other catapult.
Ganyu didn't answer, but understood. Therefore, Yae fulfilled her promise and turned from her fellow comrade. However, before heading to the other ship, she did something additionally to assist her fallen soldier. On the shore, a much distraught Keqing was suddenly surprised by a voice entering her thoughts like a distant whisper. The voice of Yae Miko, speaking a clear message to follow.
Do whatever you can to get to her. She's hurt and is in really bad shape. My kin and I can handle the second ship.
Keqing knew she didn't have much time, so out of absolute will of her love for Ganyu and adrenaline, she ran for the shore and began to swim as fast as she could. If there were any objections prior to her leave from the shore, she didn't hear them, too focused on saving Ganyu's life. She was at the wreckage in less than 20 seconds, quickly working atop the ship's side and running to Ganyu's aid.
Ganyu!
She called in desperation, meeting her love's side in seconds. Ganyu barely heard her, too out of it to focus, but upon feeling a touch to her left hoof, Ganyu peeked open her beastly eyes to Keqing. She was crying and working hard to pull the likely 10-ton beast up to her, which she knew was impossible. Using the little strength Ganyu had in her current state, she allowed herself to revert back to her human form, allowing her beloved to pull her up to safety. Once back to her usual form, Keqing pulled her beloved up out of the water as gently as possible and wrapped her tightly in her arms. She kissed Ganyu's head and cried her eyes out in relief that her beloved was safe in her arms again.
It's okay. It's okay now. I'm here. I'm here. I'll always be here.
She was so distraught that she hadn't noticed the other ship had become an emblazoned wreckage, nor had she heard the several clashes of lightning ending the lives of the vessel's occupants. Once the other ship and the monsters aboard had gone silent, for the first time that entire night, it was quiet. The battle to save Inazuma had officially ended, and all that remained was the pitter-patter of rain and the remains of that entire night of complete and utter chaos. They had won. They had stopped Inazuma from becoming another Liyue Harbor tragedy. A victory that was rewarded by the rising of the sunshine to a whole new day in the land of eternity. It had been 2 weeks since the battle against the Tsuritsu's forces, and in that time, much had happened after Ganyu had passed out in Keqing's arms from both pain and exhaustion of fighting non-stop since after sunset that night. Ever since, she'd been in a deep slumber, and her beloved had been eagerly awaiting for her to open her eyes. She'd checked in on her every single day, but after 3 days, she knew she had to seek aid beyond Inazuma. Yelan still had not returned, so she had decided to work on finding another way back to Mondstadt, knowing the very person who had healed her wounds could bring her love back to full health. At most, she knew Ganyu wasn't dead, having remembered that Qilin were very famous for sleeping rapidly and figuring that that was the cause of the elongated slumber. Nevertheless, Keqing had stayed by Ganyu's side in comfort and worry, while also taking time to decide what was next for Inazuma. The damage to Inazuma City had been devastating, but with the efforts of the people of the land and hope, she knew that the Land of Eternity would recover from its battle scars over time. She felt bad just leaving Ayaka and the others to fend for themselves, but they all understood that she needed to move on to the next nation and its people. Seeing Mondstadt was the best place to go, knowing it was where Yelan had left for, and was the place that could get Ganyu's condition better, that was her next destination in mind. She had submitted a request to the dockhand, and after a long 3 days, Keqing had found her ride back to Mondstadt. After some last goodbyes and wishing Ayaka, Raiden, and Yai the best in rebuilding their homeland, she boarded the ship with Ganyu and began her way back to the portion of Teyvat she knew best. The way back had been a very turbulent one, but after passing the storm barrier yet again, the rest of the tread had been very calm and steady. She'd arrived at the shores of Falcon Coast in no more than 15 hours after leaving Inazuma's zone, and upon departing the ship, had carried her comatose beloved all the way to the inner walls of Mondstadt. However, she'd nearly lost her hold upon seeing the state of the city's buildings, charred and stained with gunpowder. A very familiar sight she'd become traumatized with after the night she'd literally almost lost everything. However, she'd become less sick to her stomach upon seeing that life still existed within Mondstadt's tall concrete walls that acted as shields. She'd met up with her familiar allies not long after, and while nestling a cup of tea in her hands, had been filled in on what had occurred only less than a week prior. The only ally she hadn't met with was Yelan, to which she had been informed that said comrade had taken her leave with the Animo Archon and his dragon Dvalin to Fontaine the day before. She apparently had a plan in mind, and needed to go and hopefully recruit some additional allies. Upon the very mention of the God of Freedom and his elemental Drake, Keqing had been surprised and relieved. She knew that the Tsaritsa had not only failed to capture 2 Archons now, but also saw that there was hope, seeing that Mondstadt had not fallen to the attack by the androids. That gave her a boost of confidence that made her feel that, despite how much damage Inazuma had taken, it was possible for these nations to fight back and not become another Liyue Harbor. However, the discovery that elemental power possessed by Dvalin had not benefited the androids was the cherry on top of the cake, seeing when they'd eventually face the Tsaritsa, they'd need some kind of advantage. The battle for Inazuma's survival had been a battle of machines, mortals, and divine strength. The battle with the Cryo Archon would be one of a goddess, machines, and mortals. That is a whole different battle entirely, and they'd barely managed victory in Inazuma. Had it not been for the fact that Yai, Ganyu, and the yokai had had the power to demolish warships to scrap metal, the outcome for Inazuma's fate would have likely been different, and that was the clear truth that Keqing knew full well. However, she also knew that they had won, and thanks to the combined efforts and strengths of Inazuma's people, divine beings, and their matriarch, the outcome had been a clear message to the Tsaritsa that they were far from defeated. And that was the real truth. As for her beloved, upon arriving at the cathedral with Ganyu in her arms, Jean had ordered Barbara to prepare for another healing session. The damage that her partner had taken was worse than she'd thought, the impact from the hit having fractured her entire left set of ribs and bruised her lung on the same side. However, Barbara had stated that a good amount of the damage she had taken had already been healed, but not entirely. That had been enough confirmation for Keqing that Ganyu's overly extended slumber had been caused by her Qilin traits, the practical coma being one's way of healing their injuries. However, Keqing had still gone through with allowing Barbara to speed up the healing, but even with a full recovery, Ganyu still had remained asleep. To say that the fact her beloved had not opened her eyes and had scared the living hell out of Keqing was an understatement, but after some reassurance from Barbara, she had calmed down. There were still signs of life in Ganyu's body, showing that she clearly wasn't dead, so she had just decided to allow nature to take its course and rest up for the following day. That day was today, and now she sits anxiously beside her slumbering partner, resting a steaming cup of coffee in her lap. The sight somewhat sickens her, but deep down, she knows that Ganyu isn't one to fall to something like a giant fire-coated cannonball. She's a veteran of the bloodiest war in the history of Teyvat with ancient knowledge and skin as tough as leather. There's absolutely no way a petty attack like that would subdue her. Would it? Her conflicting thoughts were interrupted by the intrusion of a familiar witch she'd met the day prior. walking towards her with steady steps and stopping just off to the side of her. Usually, if one is this troubled over the state of one's health, it's a case of love. The voice of Mona Magistus spoke, causing Keqing to gasp in surprise. However, Mona acted quick to show Keqing that she meant no offense.
Oh, please, do not take it as me teasing or belittling you, Miss Keqing. I have no intention of judging you or anyone. My previous comment was only me being observant while thinking out loud, so I do apologize if I caused you any accidental offense.
Keqing sighed heavily in relief, giving Mona assurance that she could join her on the elongated bench. She walked around and took a seat next to her troubled occupant, beginning to address her reason for coming here.
Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Mona Magistus. It's a pleasure to meet you, Miss Magistus.
Oh, just Mona is fine.
Now, allow me to ease your troubles by assuring you that Miss Ganyu is going to be just fine.
Keqing jumped at that, having not expected those words to come out of Mona's mouth.
How can you be so sure? Well, let's just say that, right now, your partner is going through something very important in her slumber. As an astrologist, I have the ability to read people's destinies and fates through the use of hydromancy. And just as a precautionary act, Jean requested me to do a reading to determine Miss Ganyu's current condition. And what did you see? Well, I saw many things. Things that pertain to the near future. But most importantly, they were things that only she could understand and tread correctly. To put it into a simple way that you'll understand, the one you love is experiencing what is known as an internal epiphany, a psychological phenomenon that only occurs when the host is at a point in their life where they must realize something specific to them only. It's something that only occurs so often in one's life and is very important to experience.
Keqing took a moment to think about what Mona had just stated, having no doubt that she wasn't lying to make her feel better. The timing felt perfect for such an event to occur, even if she couldn't make a single hint out of what an internal epiphany was at all. If she had to guess, she'd assume it was something similar to when one receives a vision from the gods, a moment that changes one's life for the remainder of their existence. Not to mention that her beloved had morphed into her Qilin form for the first time in centuries, so it could have caused some sort of internal awakening. Any other way, Keqing knew the simple answer to what Mona was telling her was that she needed to allow Ganyu to complete her mental trial.
I think I see what you're saying now, and I'm willing to allow this epiphany thing to run its course. However, I must ask one thing, seeing time is not on our side. You want to know how long this will take?
Mona assumed, knowing she was right. Keqing confirmed her guess correct with a simple nod of her head, to which Mona did her best to give her an answer.
Considering my own phenomenon took 4 weeks, I'm afraid there's no telling how long it'll be before she opens her eyes as a whole new person. These trials are directly connected to whoever controls the flow of time and fate, so I'm afraid only they could give the actual answer. However, I will say that while it feels time is against you right now, nothing can alter the course of fate and destiny. So if Miss Ganyu's fate is to finish her epiphany in whatever amount of time it will take, then it cannot be changed. So, you're saying that, despite how long it'll take for Ganyu to open her eyes, it will not make a difference in how the outcome in our war with the Tsaritsa will play out? That's exactly what I'm saying, Miss Keqing. So please, do take some time away from the cathedral to get a meal in you. You look dreadful and need to get back into working condition. Otherwise, if those monsters attack us again, you won't be able to even defend yourself.
Keqing jumped at the words, having not even realized that she was starving and dreadfully tired after the endless fight back in Inazuma. It all came to her in a sudden onslaught, and to conclude her unexpected meeting with Mona, she simply got to her feet and said one thing to her new friend.
You're right, Mona. Thank you for your advice and assurance that Ganyu is safe from harm.
Oh, it's no big deal. The old hag had the same talk with me before, and I was tired of seeing you fret over nothing. Keqing smiled brightly, then started for the cathedral's exit, leaving Mona and Ganyu alone in the massive abode dedicated to the Anemo god. She'd return whenever her beloved opened her beautiful eyes again. When that would be was up to fate alone. Something she kept in mind as she heard the massive church door close behind her with a loud thud. Three weeks later. Over the time that Keqing had awaited her beloved's awakening, she'd taken residency in Dawn Winery. Diluc had given her the offer after Yelan had returned and discussed the new plan she had in mind, seeing Mondstadt was still in a state of repair before anyone could properly live humanely in their homes yet again. Therefore, until the repairs were done, Mondstadt was literally a place that was currently impossible to live in, so Keqing had no better choice. She'd assisted in helping to repair the buildings as fast as she could, while also preparing for whatever was next in the journey to put the Sarita 6 feet deep. Yelan had traveled to both Sumeru and Fontaine to relay the news of what had happened in Mondstadt, Fenty, a literal god and one of the seven, being her perfect witness to assure she wasn't making up nonsense. If the god of wind hadn't been enough, the second witness had to be, an elemental dragon as old as Teyvat itself that had witnessed the Archon War and beyond. Less to say, their cases had been accepted as truth without any bit of disbelief, and that had led to something like what Keqing and Ganyu had faced in Inazuma. The god of Dendro and Hydro had taken the initiative to bring the androids out into the open by fighting the same way that Ganyu, Keqing, and Ayaka had in Inazuma, without the use of visions and elemental power. However, an exception had been made with elemental dragons' powers, given that they could attack without any restrictions. The Dendro dragon, Apep, had not been persuaded so easily, having deep hatred for the Dendro Archon, but upon the mention that she too was a target and would never stop being hunted, only then did she agree to assist. As for the Hydro dragon, Yelan had been met with a surprise. The beast appeared in the form of a regular person, but I decided to reveal his true identity upon hearing the severity of the situation. His name was Neuvillette, and it was clear that he cared greatly for the safety of Fontaine's people. As for the Archon, Yelan had been met with another surprise upon hearing that no matriarch existed in the Nation of Justice. The only person who could count as anything close to a god stature and power was the Hydro Dragon Sovereign, so that was the only person Yelan associated with during her time in Fontaine. Just like in Inazuma, using clever tactics to drive them out of hiding, the androids had been exposed and terminated instantly. This time, the nations and their people had the element of surprise, and had shut down the Sarita's operation before it could commence. However, the attacks would never truly stop until the Cryo Archon was dead, and Yelan had made sure to make that clear before leaving Fontaine and Sumeru. They would have to keep fighting for themselves until she and her comrades entered Snezhnaya to put an end to the chaos once and for all. That day would surely come in little time, but there was still some things left to do, and it wasn't just awaiting Ganyu's return to reality. However, one thing was absolutely certain. They had put a roadblock in the Sarita's motives. The nations and their archons were now aware of the androids and their weaknesses, so they officially had the upper hand on the Cryo Archon. Another disaster like Liyue Harbor wouldn't occur anytime soon, and that was a huge checkmate in this current war. Their efforts had paid off, saying there had been no mention of Fatui-related attacks in the entire time that Keqing had been staying at the winery. However, that also had drawn a sense of unease, saying based on the recordings Yelan, Keqing, and Ganyu had witnessed, it wasn't within the Sarita's nature to be so quiet. She was more likely to throw more soldiers into the capitals of Teyvat in hopes of a sneak attack, so the fact that there had been no attacks for nearly 4 weeks meant one thing. She was taking time to rethink her tactics to achieve her goal of victory. A scary thought, but also an inevitable conclusion after 3 losses. Ganyu, Keqing, and Yelan had checkmate for now in this chaotic and bloody game of chess, but it wouldn't be long before the Cryo Archon would make her countermove. The ultimate question was when she would, though, and what would be her new tactic of regaining control over the chessboard. "You seem quite tense, Miss Keqing." A familiar voice interrupted her thoughts. Diluc had joined her at the table, taking a seat and accompanying her. "I've got a lot on my mind," she replied, picking up her coffee cup and taking a small sip in hopes of calming her dancing nerves. "It's been nearly a month since the attacks, and it's just been too quiet for comfort." "I agree, but don't worry. I have eyes in Snezhnaya right now to assure the Sarita can't sneak in an unexpected attack. I made a promise to assure that another disaster like your old home wouldn't happen again, and I intend to keep it." Keqing took another sip of her practical energy drink, then rested her cup on her provided coaster. "If I may ask, what exactly has been happening in the Cryo capital ever since mine and Ganyu's victory in Inazuma? I'd like to know, just so I can rest my worries that another Liyue Harbor isn't going to happen out of nowhere." "Well, of course. My contacts have been keeping an eye out for activity in specific areas in Snezhnaya. The docks, the Sarita's palace, and any of the areas that are connected to Fatui's sources. Less to say, there's been no activity whatsoever, meaning it's likely that the Cryo Archon is doing something that involves countering our position in this war. In other words, she's contacted every one of her Fatui harbingers and is desperate for a solution to her inability to make any progress. A frightening motion that can potentially lead us to no longer having any advantages, but as long as we keep our shields up and remain agile, we should be able to maintain our hold on any of the Sarita's future tactics." "If I had to take a guess, she's probably trying to find a way to absorb the energy of the elemental dragons. That's our biggest advantage and weapon right now, and given we found a way to fight her without the use of a vision, she's resorted to the next best option. How one can even find a way to absorb a dragon's energy is beyond me, but if she's that desperate, I can see her going to reckless tactics to regain the lead in this race." "To obtain that type of knowledge, she'd have to capture a dragon first, and that's impossible. She may be a god, but a dragon is far more powerful than a matriarch. So to even come close to finding a solution as such, it'd likely take centuries. Given she's drawn all of her harbingers and Fatui soldiers into the palace, I know exactly what she's up to. She's using them as protection, saying that right now would be the perfect time to attack and end her life." Keqing's eyes bulged instantly. Diluc had hit the nail right on the head. She wasn't making plans with her most elite forces, but using them as security to assure her safety in this time of desperation to find an answer to regain the high ground in this war. "Gods above! You're right! It all makes sense, because this would be the perfect time to attack her. We know how to fight and defeat her forces, so she's gone to the extreme to protect herself." "Correct. Now, let me ask you this. Is it the right move to attack and infiltrate the palace?" Keqing paused to think, but it didn't take long for her to come to a conclusion. As the former Yuheng of Liyue Harbor, she knew a thing or two about how to read your enemies. "No." "And why shouldn't we?" "Because that's exactly what she wants us to do.
If we attacked the palace right now, it'd be the equivalent of falling into a pit full of venomous snakes. Her harbingers would be waiting for us, and that's a suicide mission.
Very good, Miss Keqing. I'm glad you're on the same page as myself and all of our fellow Mondstadt comrades. However, if the initiative is not to attack the Tsaritsa at her lowest point, then what is the next move?
Again, Keqing paused. However, yet again, the answer came faster than she'd expected. Just as she's built up her defenses, we must build up our own, so that when the time does come to initiate, we are on an even playing field. How long it's going to take for her to attack again is unclear, but we'll be ready if we keep the high ground.
The Tianquan had a great eye for the right people. You are an excellent strategist, Miss Keqing. We are very fortunate to have you and Miss Ganyu as allies, seeing we need to play our cards perfectly if we are going to defeat an archon.
Keqing smiled at the compliment, a light blush adorning her cheeks. I appreciate the compliment, Sir Diluc. No matter how long it'll take, that ice witch will pay for what she's done.
Agreed.
He stated, getting to his feet.
Feel free to depart to Mondstadt whenever you wish, seeing you've been a great help in getting it back to its original state. I'm also aware of your comrade's condition, but don't worry, Jean is making sure that she's okay.
Thank you, Sir Diluc. Keqing finished, Diluc closing the conversation with a nod of his head. After ending the short talk, Diluc walked off to carry out his own business, allowing Keqing to take time to finish her morning joe. However, in between each sip, she took a moment to just think about what she'd just discussed with Diluc. How long would this ceasefire last? What would be the Tsaritsa's answer to her current struggle? How long would this war last? All questions that, just like Ganyu's current predicament, only fate itself could answer. Answers that could possibly take centuries to surface. A long hour had passed by the time Keqing had concluded her daily intake of coffee, having placed the empty cup back on the coaster and gotten back to her feet to start her trip back to Mondstadt. However, upon stepping out of the building, she'd been met by an unexpected face. Yelan having been on a steady walk towards the entrance prior to her exit from the winery. Yelan could only be there for two things: business with Diluc, or something that Keqing had been anxious to hear for the past 3 weeks. Oh, good. You're already here. Yelan greeted with a sly smile. Do you need to speak with Sir Diluc, or has it finally happened? Keqing said, her tone going from curious to anxious quickly. I'm very happy to say it's the latter, hun. Yelan confirmed, causing Keqing to nearly burst into tears of happiness. When she awoke, all she wanted was you. So I suggest you don't keep her waiting. Keqing smiled brightly, relieved and excited to finally see her beloved up and active again. Thank you, Miss Yelan. She thanked in a tone similar to an excited child. I'll hurry to Mondstadt right away. Yelan just nodded, watching as Keqing started to run as fast as her legs could manage to the Mondstadt Cathedral. Yelan giggled at the behavior of the usually professional Yuheng she'd known for years, adding her own comment before going off to tell Diluc the good news. The saying is true. Love makes people do some crazy things. Keqing was out of breath by the time she'd reached the doors of the cathedral, opening them to the sight of her beloved on her feet and talking with Jean at the opposite end. All professionalism went out the window, Keqing running as fast as she could to the other end of the room and embracing Ganyu in a very tight hug. Ganyu had caught sight of her beloved briefly before she was met with the comfort of her partner's arms and warm tears staining her shoulder.
She returned the embrace, tears escaping her own eyes as the two reunited after what had felt like forever.
I'm so sorry I was gone for so long.
Ganyu comforted, rubbing Keqing's back softly and slowly. Keqing didn't say anything and just continued to give her beloved all the love she could. At long last, they were together again and in each other's arms, tight and warm.
Let's give these two some time alone,
Jean stated, respecting the two's privacy. The only other occupant was Barbara, having nodded at her big sister's order and following her out of the cathedral's only exit to allow the two lovers time together.
Big sister? I thought only girls could, well, you know, love guys.
Barbara naively stated, nearly causing Jean to lose her composure in a fit of laughter. Jean somewhat kept her exclamations in her throat, working quickly to sum up her siblings' curiosity.
I'll explain when you're older,
she answered, clear embarrassment in her tone.
For now, let's just, go help out with the repairs being made to the lower part of the city, okay?
Oh, okay.
While the answers she wanted weren't given, Barbara just continued to follow her much older sister out of the building, holding her sibling to her promise. Back in the open sanctuary of the church, Keqing and Ganyu remained locked in each other's arms for a whole other 5 minutes, up until they knew it was time to talk. What had Ganyu encountered in her month-long slumber? And more importantly, how did it tie into their current battle with the Snezhnayan Queen?
I'm so happy you're back, but I believe it's time we talk about the elephant in the room,
Keqing requested softly.
You were out for an entire month, so I think you at least owe me an explanation.
Ganyu didn't object, and just nodded her head in full agreement.
Of course. However, before I can tell you anything, we need to go back to where everything began for me.
Keqing was immediately lost, but at the same time, she had a feeling that this epiphany would lead to something like this.
Where what began? My life. We need to go to where I was born over 3,000 years ago. The Peaks of Serenity.